Hey everyone, Mike here in the BFH Garage. Today's video is going to cover something a little bit different. It's going to go over some specialized tools that I use for my axle re-gearing. I've gotten some feedback from some people that have been watching those videos, and they are looking for information on how to use these specialized tools, such as your dial indicator, your inch-pound torque wrench, and your micrometer. And although these tools are all easy to use, making sure that you use them properly is going to give you a greater chance for success at the end. And why that's important is because some of these shims that you have to measure are so thin, they're the same thickness as this piece of paper. And that can make the difference between a successful gear setup and something that falls apart on you down the road. So let's get into these tools and I'll show you how to use them. Okay, the first thing I want to point out is that this video is intended to be for that first-time user that has zero experience with these tools and is just looking how to use these, so that way they can learn to re-gear their own axle if they want to do it. Now, I just want to caution anybody that is new to this that re-gearing an axle is not for the faint of heart. It is easy to mess things up, and you could have catastrophic failures resulting in needing to replace everything inside your differential. So understand that if you choose to do this, that is a decision you make, and you need to live with those consequences. So if you're wanting to learn how to re-gear, then this is intended for you. So let's start off with some of the descriptions of these tools. So the first thing I'm going to start off with here is going to be my inch-pounds torque wrench. When you look at a regular torque wrench, it's a clicker style, and as you turn it to tighten something, you'll hear it click when you reach that specific torque spec. This one here is a beam style, and there's another type you can use for re-gearing, and it's a dial style indicator. And what this does, this allows you to measure a rotating force on your pinion to make sure that you have your preload set correctly. So this one here I got online from a bike shop or something like that. This one here measures up to 60 inch-pounds of torque. And when we're talking about doing the pinion gear there, you're looking to get between 16 to 20 inch-pounds. So this beam here would only be going over a little bit. So these are pretty important to have, and I'll show you how to use that in a little bit. Next thing we have is a micrometer. I have a couple different ones. This one here is analog. It's kind of old school. Your numbers are right there. You do have some numbers here off the side, but for the purposes of us re-gearing, you're not going to need to reference those or even know what they mean, so that doesn't matter. But you can see as I turn this knob, the numbers here will move, get bigger or smaller depending on how thick the item is that I'm measuring. So as I start to open up the jaws here, and you can see that right here, that opens up, and that tells you, the numbers right here tell you how wide that opening is. So that's how you measure certain things like shim stacks, individual shims, things like that. This is a digital version of a micrometer here. This one here goes in a little bit deeper depth measurements. I don't need to go that deep. That's just the way this one comes. I'll measure them down to the thousandth of an inch. I don't need anything greater than that. So. But this does the same thing. I turn it, and then it'll measure what I need. The last thing I want to talk about is going to be the dial indicator. I think this can be pretty intimidating for some people with everything that needs to go on and move with this thing, but to be honest with you, it is a very simple tool. Even though it has all these knobs, dials, and angles, and spins, and magnets, it is a very simple tool to use, and I will go into greater detail on that. But the gist of this is right here is your measuring component. So when this thing pushes in or out, you see how that dial spins. And what that's going to do is it's going to let you check a little bit of measurement between your gear set to check backlash. But you can see you can push this thing all the way in, and it'll spin several different times, and you have a smaller dial in there that would give you greater numbers. The only thing we are going to be talking about today, and the only thing we really care about, are those small movements like that. So I'll get into that, show you how all this works as well. Okay, so the first tool I want to talk about today is going to be the micrometer. We use this micrometer to measure shim thickness, and that's important because on each side of these bearing caps, either under the bearings or outside the bearings, we have shims. And what that does, shims allow this ring gear right here to either move this way or this way. Now my hand motions here are exaggerated, but you're talking some of these shims are as thin as paper. This one here is a 3/1000 of an inch thick shim, and if you put it on one side or the other, it's going to move the carrier one way or the other that 3/1000 of an inch. And yes, 3/1000 of an inch, which is as thick as this piece of paper, can be critical in making sure that this gear is set up correctly. So when we're looking at a micrometer, I'm going to go with the digital one here first because it's probably easy to read and understand. So this one here gives me the option to zero out. You can see how that, lone hanging number out there. So I can push and hold this, and that's going to reset it to 0. Now I know I'm starting at 0. And when I back this out, you'll see the numbers move. So I'm going to take a shim that is supposed to be in the 30/1000 range of thickness. I'm going to insert it right between these 2 points right here. And as I tighten down the micrometer, and it's kind of hard to do while I'm showing you as well, as I tighten down the micrometer, you're going to hear this handle click. That tells me it's as tight as I need it to be to measure. And for being a 30/1000 thick shim, it's actually measuring at just over 29/1000. So you have to understand when they make these shims, they are not exactly 30/1000, they're not exactly 3/1000, but they're pretty darn close, and that will be good enough for us using these to set up gears. So I can back that off, pull this one out, and then I'll get one known to be close to 3/1000 here. We'll measure down on that one. And you got to be careful with these smaller or thinner shims because they bend easy, just like paper, and you can bend the shim, and if you bend the shim, it becomes useless. You need to get another one. And in today's rebuild kits, the thinner shims are getting harder to find, so you want to make sure you protect those thinner shims. So as I start to tighten that down, it's showing that I have a 3/1000 plus a little bit, another, what is that, 30/1000. So you need to understand that 3/1000 is what this shim is going to be classified as, and you don't need to worry about that other number. Now, one thing I do want to caution against, when people measure shim stacks, and you see it all the time, they'll take all of their shims together, then they'll put them in here, and they'll measure them all at once. And you don't want to do that because it has a pretty big potential to give you a false reading of what you have. There could either be gear oil or dust or something in between those shims, and you could measure something out at a certain width, and it could in fact be off by a couple thousandths or even more than that. So when you're measuring shim stacks, I highly encourage you to measure the individual shims, make sure they're clean. You got to get all the packing grease off of there. You have to get any type of gear oil that may have gotten on there, all that stuff off of there, measure them individually, then add them up to the number that you're going to want. Now on the analog version here, same thing. So I'll get my 30/1000 shim, I'll put that in there, but you're just going to watch the numbers actually change. And they're going to stop, and it should be somewhere around 29/1000, my guess. So you'll see it's 29/1000, and you don't have those additional numbers. So I would write this down as a 30/1000 shim, and then I would throw that in the mix and go from there. Now, if it's smaller towards the 29/1000 more than it is the 30/1000, then I may make a certain note on that shim that it's more towards 29, because if I have another 30/1000 classified shim and it's more towards the 31/1000 side, then I have a span there that if I'm trying to dial something in perfectly, that I could either go to a smaller shim or a bigger one by 1/1000th of an inch to get something dialed in perfectly. So understand that while I'm trying to tell you to operate in the thousandths of an inch, sometimes that little bit of a smaller shim can help out when you're really trying to get something dialed in perfectly. So that's all there is to a micrometer. It's pretty simple. I suppose I should point out real quick too that you have two different dials on this back side. This small one here opens up and it's a firm, as you close it, it's firm. So I could tighten this up and make that number start to go in the negative. You don't want to do that. You can use this to move it out, but as you get close, you want to use that knob that's going to ratchet, and that's as tight as you want to go. Now the analog one has the same thing. The big one here, that does the big tightening, and then as you get closer, you get to this one here, and it starts ratcheting. That's as tight as you want to go, and that will give you an accurate measurement consistently. Let's move on to the beam style torque wrench. Okay, so let's talk about the beam style torque wrench. Again, you could use a dial style torque wrench, but those are really expensive. And the whole purpose of this tool right here is to measure the rotational force needed to turn this pinion. And that's important because you have to have a certain amount of preload on those bearings. They need to be tucked in tight enough with each other that they don't wobble around, but you don't want them so tight that there's too much friction and they burn up on you. There's a really fine happy spot in there, and that's why we use the beam style torque wrench to determine that. Now when you sit here and look at the beam style torque wrench, you're going to see that it's graduated in inch pounds, so 10, 20, 30 on up to 60. And as you hold on to the end ball here and you start to rotate, the beam will move over to whatever the required torque is to rotate this, and that's what we're looking for. So on a new setup, I'm looking for 16 to 20 inch pounds on most occasions, but I would always like to tell everybody, go with what your particular gear manufacturer's recommendation is. I know the factory service manual gives a high end of that torque value of 20 to 40 inch pounds on the Dana 30 and Dana 44s, at least in the TJ. And for the aftermarket stuff, that's just a little bit too high. You risk a chance of burning up your bearings if you go that high. So go with what the gear manufacturer's recommendations are, or if you start getting some experience, you'll figure out what works for you. So the way this whole thing works here, from a bike shop, I got this beam style thing here, and it's got this little 1/4 inch adapter there, so I have to step it up a couple times. Now, can that affect torque? Absolutely it can, but in the case we're doing this, once everything's turned, because we're dealing with such a small amount of torque, I'm not worried about it being off by that much. It's not a big deal. Once you start turning this thing and all these pieces rotate and they get into the tight position, then your torque wrench will be as close as you need it to be to measure this. So again, we are measuring rotating force. We're not measuring what it takes to get the pinion started. You don't want to include that, because as you go to turn this, it may take a little bit to get it started, and you'll see this number jump up, and then it smooths out and evens out. And as you're rotating your torque wrench, you're looking at the indicator here for what the consistent number is as it is moving around in a circle. So to use the torque wrench, it's fairly straightforward. Put it on your pinion nut, put a little pressure on it before I take this off, and what I do is I rotate it. Now if you notice right here, you see how the beam's already starting to bend before it even starts rotating, and that's called our breakaway force in order to get this thing rotating. So I don't include that. What I do is I get it rotating so it gets away from that breakaway force, and then it will maintain a consistent torque there. And as I'm rotating this, I'm looking to see where that dial indicator, or where the beam is, and that's going to tell me what my inch pounds required to turn this is right now, or what my preload is currently set at. So I'm going to do that, start rotating. You see how it broke away? So this is a used setup, and it is reading about 12 inch pounds as I rotate. So as I'm going around, I'm just seeing where that beam's at, and it's rotating right about 12 inch pounds to turn this. Now you have to understand this is an old axle. All of this stuff's coming out. So 12 inch pounds is because this thing has been driven probably 150,000 miles. So everything's worn in, everything's starting to show wear, things start to loosen up, and that's completely normal. Okay, the last thing I want to show you is how to use a dial indicator. And the gist of a dial indicator is that this little needle right here at the end of this dial will be placed at the end of a tooth, and then you see how that dial moves as it moves back and forth. But before I get into that, I want you to understand the difference between a high pinion and a low pinion axle. So if you imagine looking at the axle from the side, a high pinion means that your pinion gear is going to be on the higher side of this differential. A low pinion means your pinion gear is going to be down here. And on a high pinion axle, your gears run in what's called reverse rotation. versus your low pinion. So if you look closely here at the teeth, you're going to see how you have one that kind of goes flat, and each tooth is the same, but you have a side that is flat, and you have a side that goes at an angle. This flat side is called your drive side. The angled side is called your coast side. Now this is a high pinion axle, so the drive side is on the upper side up here, and I have a ring gear here from a low pinion axle. And if you notice here, the flat side is on the bottom, and the coast side, which goes up at a slant, is on the top side. So understand that that's different, and that does make a difference on where you put your dial indicator. So I'm working currently on a high pinion 30, so my dial indicator I'm going to need to put on this side of the axle, or this side of the housing, and it's going to come up over and drop on, where if it was low pinion, I'd have to put it over here, and it's going to come down and over and then up. So when you start adjusting these things, you need to take that into consideration, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So by looking at the way my dial indicator is set up here, I can tell you that the last axle that I did a gear job on was a low pinion, because it's set up to be on this side and catch the drive side of the ring gear like this. So in order to set up a high pinion, I'm going to have to move everything around. You got to kind of adjust everything to fit. So you got to find a spot, you get a magnetic base here, and what that does is I can set it here, and once I turn this on, it will stay where I put it, but you got to be careful of where you put it, because it can still move a little bit. So make sure that it's firm wherever you set it. Now it doesn't matter that if it's catching a little bit of this and a little bit of that and it's at a slight angle, because once you get it set, then you'll be able to get an accurate measurement. So in this case here, if I come here and I set it, that is good enough that I could adjust this back over and catch my ring gear the way I want to do it. So now as you're looking at this, you can see that I'm nowhere near where I need to be for this thing. So I have to get things adjusted in order to do this. So this little clamp dial here allows me to move this entire assembly up or down. And like I said, based on how it's set up now, I can tell you that I was using it on a low pinion. So on a high pinion side, if I put this here, that's going to give me my most clamping force. I want to loosen this, and I'm going to move this up here, you know, a little bit of a ways here. Just random spot. It doesn't have to be exact, because you can move everything to adjust down to the tooth. Now the other thing I'm looking at here is my pin, my indicator pin there is still off of that tooth. So I have a dial here that allows me to either tighten or loosen, and I can bring it in to where I want. So now I can see that I'm getting close to that. I'm gonna take and raise it up a little bit, let it get over. Still have a problem here though, because the back side of this is hitting a tooth also. So to get this thing dialed in perfectly, no pun intended, I know, now I need to rotate this arm this way. So again, I can loosen this here, rotate it slightly out, and then I can also undo this, kind of get everything set up the way I want, put it back, and now I can loosen this, back it up into there just a little bit. And then on the back side here, I can loosen this, and it's going to allow me to rotate this up or down. And right now I feel like I'm leaning too far back, so what I want to do is loosen this up, come this way with it, take this one, move it over, and move it backwards a little bit. And then I think I'll have better success at catching that tooth. So part of it is getting everything set up right. Now, I don't know that I'm completely on that tooth. It feels like it's pretty loose still. My little knob on the back here is a little bit loose, so I got to tighten that up to make sure that the indicator is not loose, because that'll affect my reading. Then I can take this off, and I can start to slowly go down. What that's going to do is it's going to make that pin go up, and you see the dial start to move, right? That means I know that I have it engaged. I can turn it back on. Everything's right there. I want to come back here and make sure, I'm going to bring the camera over here and show you. I want to make sure that that pin right here, the measuring tool, is not rubbing up against the tooth behind it, because that would also affect your reading. So we want to make sure we get everything exactly where it needs to be, and then we could start measuring our backlash. Once you have your dial indicator set up for whether you're going to be measuring low or high pinion, you can just undo it, pull it off. The next axle you go to, it's going to be relatively close to the same position. So you should be able to just come in here, figure out which tooth it is you're going to want to measure from, get everything kind of in that ballpark, make sure that it's not catching the tooth behind, turn your magnet on, make any minor adjustments. I can look that I have a gap behind the plunger in that the tooth that's behind the one I'm measuring. Everything looks good. So once you have your dial indicator set, now what you need to do is you need to take your ring gear, and you want to make sure you're not turning the pinion because that will influence your reading. So I have a clamp on the back of mine to keep the pinion from moving at all. Normally with new gears it's not a big issue, but if you try to put too much force here up or down, it could make it go further than it needs to. So I have the pinion locked down right now where it's not going to turn. You take your ring gear and you move it back and forth, so up and down, and you see that needle move. So to get a good reading, I could leave it there and say I'm starting at 84 and I'm going to 92, which would give me backlash of 8 thousandths. Or if I want, I can go and move my indicator to where it zeroes out right there, and that gives me 8 thousandths as well. So you could either do the math in your head or you can zero it out, rotate it back and forth, and see you're at 8 thousandths right there. Now you can hear the clunk. That means one tooth is touching the other back and forth, and that sound is your backlash. So if you're just starting to learn gears, I hope that this video helped you out. I really enjoy getting the viewer request for videos they'd like to see something else on. That gives me more ideas on content that I can upload. So if you have any suggestions, let me know and I'll see what I can do. For those that are wondering how thick that piece of paper is, right here is a 3/1000 inch shim that's actually used to go by the carrier bearings. As you can see, that measures at just over 3/1000 of an inch. If I get that piece of paper that's over there, open this up and I slide this piece of paper in, regular writing tablet paper, start getting it tightened down a little bit, just right at 3/1000 of an inch. So yes, you do have shims that are as flimsy as this piece of paper.